There we go. So, I fixed the lighting issue. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul. Welcome back to another video of mine. Fixed the lighting issue, so yeah, we should be good now. This isn't, I mean, granted, the background is still just a wall, but it's slightly more interesting now, hopefully. Okay, we're going to be talking about cameras, and not necessarily just cameras in general, but how to use them. So we'll start with like the very simple stuff, the things that I like to call the, well, I haven't actually come up with a name for it yet, but the holy exposure trinity, basically. We'll just call it that for now. It's kind of long-winded, but it works. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We'll start with aperture. What aperture refers to is how open or closed the aperture of your lens is. The wider open it is, the more light comes through. The more closed it is, the less light comes through. When you're adjusting it, the lower the number, the more wide open your aperture is. And the higher the number, the more closed it is. I know, it's counterintuitive. I don't know who decided it was going to be that way, but that's just how it is. So if you have a lens that goes all the way down to f1.4, that's going to be significantly more wide open than a lens that goes to f1.8 or f2 or f2.8. Another thing about aperture is it affects your depth of field. Depth of field basically is the amount of your image that is in focus. If you have a deep depth of field, a closed aperture gives you a deeper depth of field, so there's more of your image that's in focus. Whereas if you have a shallower depth of field, you have a more wide open aperture, it's like that. It's like taking a portrait if you think about it. Like, for example, this one. If you shoot this wide open, just your subject is in focus and your background just kind of melts away. I personally really like that. Doesn't work well for things like landscapes, but for portraits, which I shoot a lot of, it's buttery, crispy, smooth, deliciously out of focus bokeh backgrounds, and I love it. Let's talk shutter speed. Shutter speed basically refers to how fast your shutter opens and closes when you actually take the picture. And so the higher your shutter speed, the faster that is. And so the less light is allowed to hit your sensor while your shutter is open. This, of course, decreases your exposure, but also increases how sharp your photo can be, especially if it's of a moving subject. If you have a slow shutter speed, it's open for longer, and any movement that takes place while it's open will be blurred. That's why if you're shooting like sports or maybe people running or wildlife or something that's going to move, you want to have that fast shutter speed because you want to get your subject nice and sharp and you don't want any motion blur. However, if you're doing things like long exposures, you're shooting, I don't know, like maybe doing some astrophotography, things where light is relatively low, or you purposely want that motion blur, like for example, water, you want things that are moving to be blurred, and so you will lower your shutter speed so it will stay open for longer. Keep in mind this does increase exposure as you are letting more light hit your sensor over a longer period of time. And finally comes ISO. ISO is a little weird. Basically what it is it's increasing how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. Think of it as adding fake light to a photo. The higher your ISO number is, the higher the exposure of your image. But if you go too high, you start getting grainy, weird, like sandy, artifacty, weird, just blech, in your photo, and I don't like that. I'm very when it comes to grain, unless it's intentional. And sometimes I will add it into photos where needed. But the higher that number, the more light, the higher exposure your image is, but the more grain that you risk getting into your photo, into your footage, anything like that. It really depends on whatever situation you're in. If you want to shoot with a wide open aperture to get that nice shallow out of focus backgrounds and the shallow depths of field, you're going to have to lower your ISO. You're going to have to raise your shutter speed if you're outside where it's somewhere bright and you still want to shoot wide open. Alternatively, if you want that deep depth of field, you're shooting a landscape or something, you're going to close that aperture up so that your depth of field goes whoop, and then in order to compensate if the light isn't exactly how you would like it or you don't have control over it, like maybe daylight for instance, you might have to raise that ISO, you might have to lower that shutter speed. It's a balancing act, and I really do like it. It can be a little tricky. The best way I can say to actually figuring this stuff out is just go out and do it. Go out and shoot where the only thing you play with is aperture, and then come back and see what that looks like, and then go out and do it again where the only thing you really play with is ISO, and then again with the shutter speed. Get yourself in different situations where you're going to have to use these different things to shoot. And shoot well. Practice really does make perfect. It's not necessarily like I tell you and then magically you can just kind of go out and do it. I tell you and then you have some sort of idea, but it is really going to take putting in the work. It's going to take going out there and taking tons and tons and tons of mediocre photos until you really get it and you nail those ones that are just that, you know, make you dance all the way home. I've had those. Oh, I love those. You go out and you shoot. And you shoot like 100 photos and maybe 2 of them are really good. But those 2 you're just like super excited about for an entire week. Yeah, I love those. So if you have any questions, leave them down below in the comments. And also I'll put a link to my Instagram profile in the description. You can always hit me up on there as well if you have any questions, and I will do my best to answer them. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Again, my name is Paul. Go out and shoot, don't break your stuff, but don't be afraid to try. Not breaking your stuff, but I'm gonna just shut up now.